Maham Fayaz, and I am a lecturer at Riphah Institute of Clinical and Professional Psychology, and I will be your host for today's session. Welcome to our webinar titled Theory to Practice Training the Next Generation of Islamic Psychology Practitioners, organized by the Riphah Institute of Clinical and Professional Psychology. I would like to begin by acknowledging our head of department, Dr. Aruj Arshad, to whom we are extremely grateful. She has continuously provided us with the platform to bring forward such important and relevant discussions. Her guidance and vision have truly allowed us to engage in such meaningful dialogue. We are also deeply honored to host Dr. Abdullah Rothman, who joined us a while ago and who is a distinguished scholar and global leader in the field of Islamic psychology. He serves as the clinical director at al-Shifaa and also heads the Islamic psychology department at the Cambridge Muslim College. He is also the dean and founder of the International Association of Islamic Psychology, and his pioneering work integrates Islamic spiritual and ethical principles with modern therapeutic practice. So it bridges the gap between Islamic psychology and what we practice in the modern world. Today, he'll be speaking on the foundations of Islamic psychology and its relevance in modern therapeutic practice. Thank you, Dr. Rothman, for joining us today. And without any further delay, I'd like to warmly invite you to begin the session.
Jazakallah khair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation to address the Riphah Institute. I've been connected with Riphah for quite some time. I had the opportunity of visiting briefly in 2017 with Dr. Malik. We were there with Dr. Malik Badri previously, but we went with Professor Rashid Skinner. It's been quite a long time, but it's good to be connected, and I'm honored to be with you all today. So what I'd like to discuss today is we have lots of discussions about Islamic psychology, and I've done a lot of work in putting forward theories of Islamic psychology. And there's been a lot of talk about this. And so what I want to do today is not necessarily go into that theory. There's quite a lot of material on that. I've given lots of lectures on my model and on different aspects of the development of the foundations of Islamic psychology. And what I want to do is touch on that, and in light of that, talk about what does that mean for practitioners, especially in the time that we are in now, where Islamic psychology has had a huge uptake in interest, and there's a lot of young people and a lot of practitioners wanting to get into this field. And so what I'd like to focus on today is what are the things that we need to consider when we are training people to go into practice, because it's one thing to understand the theory, and it's very deep, and we can spend our whole lives dedicated to understanding the nuances of the Islamic paradigm of human psychology. And a lot of people who get into the field want to jump to practice. How does this apply? How do we have it help people? Because this is what we are in the field of applied psychology and mental health. And so I want to talk about what are some of the important considerations as we make that transition and understanding the different dynamics involved in putting theory into practice. So what I'd like to talk about today is just briefly open with kind of distinguishing between Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology. To my focus really is Islamic psychology, and because a lot of people are new to these fields, often there is a conflation of the two, and so I want to just spend a little bit of time distinguishing that, then look at the kind of critical needs for the field of Islamic psychology as it's coming into development, and how that informs then training practitioners, and talk about competencies specifically that we've looked at and developed. And then I want to present some research that we've done in looking at an Islamic psychology training program that I've been doing at Cambridge Muslim College. And then briefly end with sort of some talking about development of the field, inshallah. So Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology, we often hear these terms used separately or together, and not necessarily everybody has an ability to distinguish the two, and sometimes there's a lot of crossover. But I think it's important that we understand Muslim mental health being a field that essentially takes everything that we know about mental health, and as it's defined in primarily the Western academia of this field of psychology, is talked about as the study of behavior and mental processes and behavior. And so mental health is looking at primarily the mind and how that definition of psychology of behavior and mental processes impacts people who identify as Muslim. So what that becomes is more of a cultural orientation or adaptation to a certain population of people with an otherwise accepted notion of psychology as positioned from a Western paradigm. Whereas Islamic psychology is looking not necessarily at Muslims per se as the main focus. Often that's who it makes most sense to, but really it's looking at the study of the soul, which all human beings have a soul, from the Islamic worldview, or the paradigm that is posited by the Quran and the Sunnah. And so this is a very different position in that we're looking at the whole definition of psychology from an Islamic lens that can still apply to non-Muslims. It's not necessarily a cultural adaptation of an otherwise predetermined Western orientation to the human being and human psychology. And so this field of Muslim mental health, I want to first talk about Muslim mental health. This emerged primarily in around 2006. There's quite a number of institutions, both in the West as well as in the Muslim world. And this has been a great shift for over the past 20 years or so, shifting the needle from kind of destigmatizing mental health. You know, it used to be that we as Muslims and the Muslim community would kind of not even consider mental health and not see it as something that is compatible with the deen, with religion. And so there's a lot of work that has been done to get Muslims involved in just opening to mental health. And so that often this journal, these institutions, the International Association of Muslim Psychologists was developed around 2006. Dr. Malik Badri had started that, and it was around looking at it can be looking at the psychology of Muslims, and it can also be looking at how Muslims engage with, behavioral health as it's defined. And so a lot of research trends looking at mental health statistics among Muslim populations, public health education, mental health support for Muslim refugees, and understanding the psychology of Muslims. And so this is something that's tricky in that in order to look at the psychology of Muslims, we have to define Muslims sort of monolithically and look at them as a people. And yet we know that there are people who are Muslim who come from vastly different cultures all over the world. And many Muslims have many different cultural orientations to their own struggles in the world, things that they go through, and the way that they make sense of things. And so what the difference in Islamic psychology, this field started to develop more specifically or with more intentionality of distinguishing between Muslim health, around 2017, there was a number of institutions that came out that were kind of moving into making the distinction, not necessarily saying that they don't exist within the Muslim mental health field, but more specifically looking at how do we define Islamic psychology as a different paradigm of looking at the human being, not necessarily just focusing on Muslims and their engagement with mental health or cognitive behavioral orientations, but the field of Islamic psychology is looking at, well, what does the Quran say about the development of the human being and the nature of the human being, which involves much more than just the mental aspect of the mind, and it defines the human being with body, soul, spirit in a much more integrated way that doesn't separate a lot of other things that we would say are part of other fields like physical health or spiritual guidance. We tend to separate those into medicine and religion, whereas in an Islamic paradigm of the human being, looking from what the Quran and the Sunnah and the classical sources position it, is that all these things are integrated, and you can't necessarily just deal with the mind and helping people understand their behavior without understanding how that impacts the qalb, the spiritual heart. So we're looking at metaphysics because we're dealing with the spirit. We're dealing with, Islam talks about the soul and the soul's connection to its primordial existence before this life and its existence after this life. Very different than looking at just clinical psychology from looking at studying the mind and behavior, because that's very much influenced by a worldview that does not involve God and does not involve the akhirah and does not take into account different epistemology, different ways that we understand what is true knowledge. So what this field of Islamic psychology is opening up, not looking at the epistemological bias of the Western social sciences that only looks at what we can see and measure, but actually taking into account wahi, revelation, that teaches about the unseen aspects of the human being. So these organizations, the International Association of Islamic Psychology, was also formed by Professor Malik Badri in response to the need to shift into really looking at these this different paradigm. And so a lot of development has happened over the past, let's say, 20 years or so. We did this study in 2016, and so already this is out of date, and there's other studies that have come out from it. But what, just to look at that transition that was happening, is that there was research looking at the kind of unification of Western and Islamic beliefs and practices. There's a lot of research around historical counts of Islamic psychology. A lot of Islamic psychology tends to focus on what are the early Muslim scholars' contributions, because that is a lot of history that has been lost. And there wasn't as much at the time development of theoretical models and frameworks to understand what is the difference between an Islamic paradigm of psychology and the Western assumptions of what the human being is and how that impacts our mental health and well-being. And then even less so, because there wasn't as much developed frameworks, there was less development of interventions and techniques specific to this Islamic paradigm. And there's been quite a lot of development of assessment tools, because the clinical psychology field tends to like things that are measurable and scales and things that are normed and things that can be fit within the positive empiricist orientation to science and research. But that doesn't necessarily capture the things that are fundamentally have a ghaibi aspect to them, an unseen dimension based on the soul and the spirit and the spiritual dimension. And so The challenge is then, how do we move into looking at taking seriously the Islamic paradigm, which fundamentally involves the soul and its connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the role of the longer eternal trajectory of the human being that involves akhirah, not just behavior and cognition according to the dunya. And so this widens the scope, and there has been a development then in people wanting to understand, what does this look like in application, in psychotherapy. So people have spent a lot of time, there's been a lot of work involved in developing methods of integration with the spiritual Islamic psychology frameworks in clinical applications. And so these are 4 books that are sort of examples of some of the core work that came out after that period of time. A lot more is coming out now. There's almost research articles coming out every month on this topic because it's becoming very popular. We did this book, Dr. Amber Hawk and I published this book several years ago, and looking at the development of Islamic psychology specifically around the globe in 17 different countries, to track what is the development that's been happening that is distinct from Muslim mental health, and really looking at what are the efforts that have been made to develop these different paradigms in parallel with, in oftentimes, or outside of the kind of mainstream Western development of psychology. And now, because the field is growing so rapidly, this book almost is out of date now, because just in the past 4 years since its publication, there's been quite a lot of development. And so we'll talk about that, inshallah. So where we're at in the state of the development of the field of Islamic psychology is that there's now quite a lot of research and publications, whereas before, not too long ago, it was scarce and sparse, particularly in English. There was, a lot of things published in Persian and Arabic and Turkish, and in the Western kind of English-speaking academic world, there's now quite a lot of publications. And with that has come an increasing wave of eager students and professionals who really want to come into this field and are looking to be trained. And there, as much as there are new programs arising, it's still very much in a development phase where the need is outweighing the demand is outweighing the supply, essentially. And so there's quite a lot of demand for training, and I would say oftentimes an assumption that there should be an availability for this, but people are sort of not necessarily aware that this is, even though this has been going on for quite a long time, the development of it in academic programs and training is still quite new. But we have had in the past few years some of the first certifications by the International Association in practitioners who have completed certified programs. And we'll talk a little bit more later, inshallah, about how there are now, this year we'll be announcing quite a number of different programs that are IIP certified, with a lot more pathways for people to choose from. So I want to talk a little bit about the critical needs for the field. This is kind of from my assessment and just on a light kind of overview before we get into some more specifics. There are cultural competency aspects for what practitioners need to be aware of. Part of that is understanding the diverse populations of Muslims, that all Muslims are not alike, that they come from different countries, they deal with different things, they have lots of different orientations. And so we need to look at this from a very dynamic standpoint and not group all Muslims as one monolithic cultural group. And the ability to not only distinguish between those cultural nuances, but also perspectives and clinical diagnoses, and how culture interacts with faith and people's belief, as well as how that interacts with their modern life and the modern systems that we often operate in the clinical milieu, which doesn't understand the cultural context often, and which even in a place like Pakistan, where you have a population of Muslims, Muslim majority, there is still an underlying fundamental orientation to Western models, and Western medicine and the clinical milieu that is informed by a very much a scientific understanding that doesn't necessarily integrate religion and wahi as something that is fundamentally present in our treatment of clinical cases. And so part of that development that we need is that competency is really not only just honoring the Islamic worldview, and this goes for Muslim practitioners who are working with Muslim clients just as much as it does in non-Muslim majority places, in that honoring the Islamic worldview within a clinical context means allowing a different understanding of epistemology, of how we understand what is real knowledge, that actually includes revelation in the Quran, not just what we can study and measure from brain science and cognitive neuroscience. The Islamic worldview absolutely includes that cognitive neuroscience, because that's part of the reality of Allah's reality, but it's only a part. There's other dimensions that we also need to include if we're looking really at an Islamic psychology. And so also the cultural aspect is being sensitive to intergenerational trauma. A lot of the things that are happening, especially currently, have a major impact on people's mental health that is far beyond what people are dealing with now. Briefly, just kind of some of the things that we see is normalizing depression and anxiety amongst believers. This is something that people have been told oftentimes by their religious leaders, that if you just have more faith, if you're a good Muslim and you do what you're supposed to do, you won't be depressed and have anxiety. This is a problematic positioning, and it doesn't necessarily honor and understand current contexts of the modern Muslim or modern person. Supporting communities in managing ongoing trauma, presenting practical well-being from the Islamic tradition. This means really looking at what are the tools that we have from the Islamic tradition that oftentimes people separate as religious practice and don't integrate with practices of well-being and health, because they've separated out religion from regular life. And what we could stand to do more of is understand that the religious practices and the deen in and of itself is a practical path of well-being that we have in many ways become disconnected from, because of we live in oftentimes societies that are so influenced by non-Islamic paradigms of capitalism and that kind of don't get at the root of the Islamic worldview. And then understanding the self from Islamic models of the soul, rather than just taking in full the models that we learn from Western academia, which often is teaching us about the self and the human being that goes back to maybe the 18th century. We're often studying in psychology people who are teaching us about human development, and they're scholars from the 18th century, when we have scholars going back to the 7th and 8th century, Muslim scholars who are doing very detailed, deep scientific study about the human being and human nature, that were rooted in this paradigm that does honor the soul and does honor revelation. And so we don't necessarily need to rely on or assume that things are better just because they are from the West, but that actually the things that we have in our tradition are legitimate and are well established, and also involve the spiritual dimension. So some of the practical gaps in the field that I would say are that we have an insufficient number of practitioners given the rise in demand. There's a lot of people looking for this type of Islamically integrated care and not finding enough people who are competently trained. And this means that we need more training programs. This is something that's beginning to happen. But these training programs, we need ones that really prioritize and are not shy about teaching from the Islamic paradigm from a bottom up rather than top down. Top down meaning sort of the easier way is to adapt Islamic language and Islamic concepts onto pre-existing Western frameworks, versus really looking from the ground up as how do we understand these things from the Quran itself. And we need more evidence-based studies that are nuanced, that don't just fall into the positive empiricist, it's only real if we can see it, measure it, and reproduce it, but actually how do we measure, or at least get a sense of honoring the heart and the spirit, the ruh, as part of the self, is much harder to measure. And yet we still need to be able to have a space that considers that in a real way. And there just needs to be more research and development that honors the spiritual as well as the tangible. So now I want to get into looking at what does this mean now for training all of these people who are either practitioners who want to adapt their way of working to be more Islamically integrated, and new students who are wanting to come into this. What are the competencies that they need to have? We did this article a few years back in 2020. It's part of the book that Khalil Center put out with their model of Islamically integrated psychotherapy that they call TIIP. And I contributed on this particular chapter where we hashed out what are the practitioner competencies. So the three main areas that we looked at, or that we determined are important, is that they need skill and knowledge of theory in the clinical milieu. So understanding case conceptualization, understanding the dynamics of clinical psychology, much of which we can get from our Western training. But then in addition to that, these practitioners needs to be well rooted in the Islamic sciences. They need to be at the very least familiar and having guidance, mentorship in Islamic spiritual interventions as we have them in our tradition from all of the deep tradition from the Maristans, the al-Shifaa, and there's many deep ways of healing that we need to learn about, but need to be grounded also in aqidah, in fiqh, in understanding the Islamic sciences to understand how that all works in terms of the kind of usul of this. And then in addition to that, those two areas which are about knowledge, and data and information and being aware and having knowledge of things, there's also this internal qualities that need to be present in the practitioner that has to do with their own process of purification of the self, right? Because from an Islamic perspective, a huge part of psychology, the soul, is about purifying the nafs, purifying the qalb, the heart. And so an investment in one's own development and internal qualities and character development is going to become very necessary, because there's going to be inevitably, when we talk about Islam and psychology, not just as separate, but Islamic psychology, there's an inevitability that there's going to be some sort of spiritual guidance in that, right? Because we're bringing Allah into the picture. And so you're guiding the person to be reliant on Allah and recognize that Allah is ultimately the one that's healing, not the method, not the practitioner. And so there has to be a level of commitment on an even professional development level, for the practitioner to be working on their own tarbiyah or development and psychospiritually. The model that we came up with in that article, we talked about how traditionally this role would be occupied either as a tabib, like a physical medicine, or as a murshid, or a spiritual guide within the tradition. And so what we're proposing is that the Islamic psychotherapist falls in the Venn diagram in between these two positions. It's not necessarily somebody who has mastery over medicine in the physical realm. We can refer to other clinicians for that. And it's not necessarily somebody who is at the level of being able to be somebody like a Sufi sheikh that is guiding somebody towards different levels of their spiritual rank. This is something that we leave to the religious scholars and the masters for that. But there is positioning a third space that becomes necessary because of the modern era that we live in. And this is something that has been mentioned by scholars like Imam al-Ghazali, who said that you should take a rafiq. If in the absence of having a sheikh, that everybody needs to have another person to help them reflect and deal with their inner world on the path of becoming aware, self-aware. And we, in this article, proposed, this is just this is a bigger table, but this is just an example where we talk about the different roles of the tabib, the medical practitioner, the Sufi sheikh, and where we see the Islamic psychotherapist falling in between. This, you would find previously when we talk about ilm nafs, traditionally, the science of the soul, many of the practitioners or the scholars that we reference as early Islamic psychology contributors were known as physicians. They were masters of physical medicine, but they were also theologians. They had a mastery of the knowledge of the Islamic sciences, and they were integrating those two together. And that's a pretty high level of expectation for clinicians. And so we have to understand that there's got to be at least a bare minimum of knowledge in all of these areas, while having the ability to refer to religious guides as well as physical medicine, whether that is physical, medical doctors, or even in the realm of mental health, psychiatrists. Many people are trained in counseling psychology and don't necessarily have a medical training in psychiatry. And so working together of understanding, if we're dealing with the Islamic model is holistic and it's integral and it's about holism, not reductionism. And so we have to deal with all of it together, which means if all of those competencies aren't present in one practitioner, then there needs to be a multidisciplinary practitioner model, because we do fundamentally, my position anyway, is that in order to make it truly Islamic, we really do have to deal with all elements of the human being. Nafs, aql, qalb, ruh, jism, the body, the mind, the soul, the spirit, the self. We can't just deal with the mental health aspect because it is fundamentally integral to the rest of the system of the human being as we are taught in the Quran. So from this, we came up with 6 proposed competencies that are relatively standard. So what I've done is I've highlighted the ones that are a little bit different, that are particular, but we have to also, it's a balance of competency that you would find in traditional or regular or mainstream clinical spaces. There still needs to be a regular competency for that clinical milieu. But then we also have to have the dimension of the Islamic paradigm. And so here we're looking at, foundational knowledge like you would anywhere, but then robust moral and ethical principles based on a guided understanding of the Islamic tradition. This means, usually in the West, oftentimes there's like the absence of morals or values because we don't know necessarily, people don't agree on them. But when we're coming from an Islamic grounded approach, there's fundamental ethical principles that are foundational, that cannot nor should not be ignored, and they need to be understood. How do we bring those things into the space without it being the projection of religious assumptions or directions on the person, but there is values and morals that need to be underlying. So it's not this like fully Western kind of client-centered approach where it's totally unconditional, because there are conditions in set by Allah for what is best for human development. And then, the other things, relational qualities, strong ability to develop therapeutic alliance. This is just fundamental counseling, but we can also learn from the prophetic model, in how to do this in a way that is oriented towards the Islamic model. Flexibility and balance in thoughts and emotions, ability to observe. So these are, kind of standard competencies. Mentor and collaboration is really important, especially when you're bringing in the Islamic spiritual aspect to it, because there has to be an understanding that there has to be sort of, we traditionally in the Islamic tradition have a system of ijaza, of permission to teach certain things or to guide people. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to be at that level, but that just means they have to be in a chain of transmission of having permission from somebody that's overlooking what they're doing, especially when it comes into guiding people in a way that is impacting their relationship with Allah and their deen. And that may be through partnership with an imam or a sheikh, but it can also be to whatever level of competency the practitioner has. And then modeling of the perfection of character is something that's fundamental to Islam. The Prophet ﷺ was sent as a model of good character, and much of what we learn in the tradition is about tahdhib al-akhlaq, the refinement of character, and that is very much going to impact the way that the person is able to help somebody is in their character and that work that they're doing on their own heart. And then, rooted grounding in the Islamic sciences and understanding what that different epistemological and ontological paradigm of the human being is, that they're not just reverting to models that are informed by a, let's say, dualist understanding of the human being that's influenced by different paradigms of ideologies that are oftentimes thought of as just purely science. But when we're dealing with the human being, it's never going to be just purely science unless we're only looking at the function of the brain. But the Islamic paradigm involves much more dimensions to it, and so the person needs to be anchored in the aqidah and the worldview of Islam. This is a model that was from my own research, and this around the clinical scope, looking at where does the Islamic psychotherapist fall in the traditional notion of, let's say, spiritual development of the soul, whereas we're just helping the person reach equilibrium. Much of the things that people are suffering from are an advent of living in the modern world that is disconnected from a spiritually oriented way of living. If we look at generations ago, this wasn't as big of a problem because we were integrated. And so bringing people to equilibrium often is getting them to even orient themselves to their faith and their religion and their practice in a way that understands how do we just be balanced in the mind, body, soul, spiritual before you can even work on the deeper levels of purification of the heart that people are often talking about when they're referring to, the perfection of character. Many of us are just in need of support to deal with getting to equilibrium in our being. And in this quote here, this is from one of the participants, or about the participants, is that many of them in this study, many of them were saying that the heart is the center of the person and their psyche. And so the work of Islamic psychotherapy is not centered completely just on the mind. We always see the pictures of psychology with the brain in the head, and it's this severed head disconnected from a body. But in Islamic paradigm, is the heart is the center of the human being. And so that repositions how do we then deal with the spiritual heart. And the qalb is really central in all models of Islamic psychology. There's lots of different models. This model is one that I produced from my research. It's my interpretation of Quranic sources and early Muslim scholars' sources. But essentially, if we're looking at what the Quran is teaching us, it's very much over and over centralizing the heart as the center of the human being, and the aql, or the mind, or the intellectual function, as something that is there and it's important, but it actually has aspects connected to the qalb. And so this is really what changes when we look at a top-down versus bottom-up. So if we were to just put Islamic principles onto an already Western notion of therapy, we'd be looking at primarily cognitive behavioral orientations. But we are looking at the heart. And so from this perspective, then, we need to consider what that means in looking at the whole being, and what does that need for somebody who is a practitioner. How are they going to be able to deal with these things that are sort of deeper down underneath the surface? And so this other model from my research, this iceberg model, looks at how do we deal with these deeper things that aren't necessarily what we're used to dealing with when we deal with measurements of what is visible. So we're looking at this as an iceberg where the nafs, or behavioral aspects, we can see above the waterline. The thoughts are something that are kind of just below the waterline, but we're still dealing with those usually in a Western model, the aql. But then we're not dealing with, in a Western model, the qalb, the spiritual metaphysical heart, nor the ruh, the spiritual reality of the human being that is connected to Allah, that is a servant of Allah, and that will continue on after this life. And so if we're going to really position ourselves from a purely Islamic model, that means we need to practically engage these deeper dimensions. And that brings in a whole different realm, not only of the clinical understanding of psychology, but it positions a practitioner in a much more sensitive area to be dealing with the nature of the soul. Now, we could say, well, I don't want to deal with it. We shouldn't have clinicians dealing with this spiritual part because that's religion and that's spiritual guidance. Meanwhile, if we're honoring the Islamic paradigm, we can't deny that the person comes into the room with the qalb and the ruh as part of their being. And now if we're only dealing with their thoughts and trying to reprogram their thoughts, and we're going to ignore all of this underlying reality of the human being, how Islamic is that? And who is going to deal with these deeper dimensions of the human being? And are we going to just relegate it to read Quran and do your salah, and that will be taken care of? Or is there a way, as there was traditionally, that we need to actually understand how all of this impacts one another and not make this as a separation? And so that's a much bigger project for training than just understanding what are some of the ahadith and Quranic ayah that we can paste on top of cognitive behavioral therapy. So I want to end with sort of just giving you an example of a program of training that we've developed at Cambridge Muslim College. We did a study. We called it RIPP, Research and Understanding the Heart in Islamic Psychology, because this is something that usually doesn't get looked at because it's not as measurable. And so we wanted to understand, how do we develop practitioners' competencies with the looking at, we know all kinds of stuff about how do we develop people's counseling skills, how do we develop their understanding of the mind. We have plenty of research and training in clinical psychology that we don't need to throw out. We still need to train people in that. But what we're often missing is understanding the spiritual dimension and the nature of the qalb, and how the practitioner's own state, their own hal, the state of the practitioner's heart, fundamentally impacts their ability to bring the reality of Allah as the healer, as Ashafi, into the therapeutic relationship. So what we did is we set out to look at, first of all, the program was designed in a way that is both ta'lim and tarbiyah, meaning we teach the fundamental knowledge that we deem necessary to be grounded in Islamic psychology theory, but we also do tarbiyah with the practitioners in training, meaning their own development, their own working on their own psychological development, their own purification of their heart, and understanding that their state, their relative state, and we know this from counseling, even from a Western conventional model, they say that the practitioner can only take the client as far as they have gone themselves, that they have to do their own psychological work on themselves. Now, this positions even more from when we bring in the spirit into it. And so we have these modules that we teach the ta'lim aspect, but then for tarbiyah, integrated into the program was suhbah. So even though the program's online, we build a space of vulnerability amongst the people where people are able to share, they're able to feel that support in group companionship. They're also doing watching themselves, muraqabah, guided practice of watching what is in the inner self, just like we have in our tradition practices that fundamentally look at self-awareness from how am I monitoring and being accountable for the own state of our heart, because that's going to be, the more that we can purify the nafs, get our own deluded self-direction out of the way, the more Allah's direction, guidance, and healing will be able to be present in guiding the person to Allah rather than guiding them to what the practitioner thinks is best, right? And so muhasabah is, we implemented reflective journaling for people to take into account themselves throughout the process of the program. So even though they're learning all these deep concepts of the soul and putting into practice, they're also having this reflexive process of self-accountability. And so what we did to measure this, we call this research lab measuring the unmeasurable. So we're looking at how can we measure things that are fundamentally sort of less tangible, of like the state of the heart. So we created these experience rulers that we developed so that we can get a sense before the program where their orientation to different levels of aql, nafs versus jism and ihsas and emotions, and their awareness of their heart. And so we're looking at how are they developing throughout the program based on their reflection. And what we found is that what this chart sort of shows is that we saw a general decrease in trends in cognitive and emotional dimensions of experience, and a heightened trend was observed in awareness of the body, of experiencing one's heart and one's spirit from the baseline. So most people, and very much so most clinical psychology practitioners, are very much oriented towards cognitive behavioral orientations to the self without a real understanding of what is the heart. Do we even have, what is the heart, just a thing that pumps blood? Or what's the actual spiritual reality that the Quran teaches us about? as a metaphysical heart in the chest. Allah says it's not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts in the chest, the sadr. And so through this orientation, we found that the students were much more, there was an increase in experiencing of one's whole being by the end of the diploma. Then we also measured the confidence of them implementing this with practitioners. So all these students are practicing therapists already, and so their confidence in putting this into practice, looking at the parallels of their own self-development with the ability to put this into practice. And so the confidence ruler, we didn't really observe much decrease in participants' confidence in addressing these 5 different aspects of the human being. Unlike the self-experiencing ruler, the participants increased in their confidence in addressing the aql with clients, even though they themselves might focus their attention in themselves more towards the aspects that they were more intuitively influencing the heart. And so what this data demonstrated was a clear transformation where practitioners were increasing their confidence in applying this in their own work. And a key aspect of that work is they had to do what they had to do on themselves through their own reflection and personal growth. And so this was some of the themes that came out of their journals. Them getting in touch with their own internal struggle, understanding their emotions, grappling with this, the awareness of their full self, not just being oriented to thoughts in the mind, making sense of the integration, and how that involves tawakkul, trust in God, and sort of the centering in the heart. And so they progressed from what was primarily cognitive and emotional to this more spiritual depth, because we were getting they themselves to experience it. And so this is something that I think is often what is missing from the training of practitioners, is that there isn't this experiential aspect of the spiritual dimension of Islam, because oftentimes we're oriented to Islam itself as a transactional aspect of, we have our religious rituals, and then we orient ourselves to psychology often in a transactional way of where we understand the method and we apply the method. But what the Islamic paradigm teaches us is that the state of the heart has a huge impact. And so if we're going to be doing this type of work, then we need to design this into programs that have the students that are fundamentally looking at themselves in a reflective way, and experiencing this and developing their own path of growth, not just learning a model to apply. So finally, just to kind of conclude, I think when we're looking at these programs and developing practitioners, we need to really balance the clinical and the human experience, that we're rooted this in an experiential thing, and it can't be reliant on theory. Practitioners need to be embodying these principles more than just professing them, and they need to be connected to the tradition of how this has looked traditionally in this model of tarbiyah and talim, as they learn how to figure out how to put it into practice in the modern times. So it's not that we're looking back to the past and trying to recreate what people did before. We very much have to do it in the modern world, but we have to do it in a way that honors the tradition and honors the Islamic paradigm, and not just seeing it as this separate cultural thing that we're going to paste on top of an otherwise, in some ways, incompatible model that doesn't involve God or the spiritual dimension. And then I'll just say that the International Association of Islamic Psychology has been in development for a number of years, and we're relaunching this year. And there's quite a lot of exciting developments that are happening that will hopefully match and meet the needs of the growing needs of the field. And so this is like theories and standards of theory and practice, certifying more training programs, certifying individual practitioners, having there be more opportunities for people to collaborate on research. And so we're hopefully relaunching in the next couple months, and there'll be a lot of developments that you can follow. These are some books that we've published over the past few years, with more to come. As I said, the field is always developing, so it's the need for these things to continue and to be updated. We do have a pathway for certification where people go through certain courses that has been certified. So there are different institutions that have their own training courses that may teach it in a different way. But what the association does is make sure that it's according to the ulama of scholars, that it falls within the Islamic the fold of Islam, to define it as Islamic psychology versus Muslim mental health. And then people can go through supervision, and then they can be certified. Currently, these are the training programs that are certified, but in a few months, we're going to be adding quite a number of programs to this, because there's a lot of programs that have come out in the past year or two, and we're going through certification. I want to just say, this is the definition that the association has produced with a panel of scholars. Islamic psychology is the systematic study of mental, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual dimensions of the human being, integrating evidence from empirical, rational, and revelatory sources, as well as verifiable reports and transmitted wisdom from the Islamic tradition. So what this does is, from an IIP standpoint, it makes the definition quite wide, so that there's lots of different approaches that can be taken, different styles, different schools of thought, but that it is all defined by how the Quran positions the human being, that doesn't just look at the mind, doesn't just look at what is measurable only by evidence on a material level, but actually also from revelation. This is the website. Right now, you won't find anything on the website because we're overhauling it. But if you visit it inshallah, in 2 months from now, there'll be all kinds of resources that you'll be able to find, inshallah. Thank you so much, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rothman. That was truly insightful. We had quite a few questions pour in during the talk, and it would be wonderful if you could address those, if you could touch on those as well. So the first question we have is from Ms. Saima Farzok, who says, how can academic institutions like Riphah contribute to creating structured training programs in Islamic psychology?
Well, I think the way that the contributions can either be through research, through developing ways that support the development of theory and training programs that are like in pieces. So it could be research, like, for example, the research that we did out of this program. Yes, we developed a whole curriculum and a program. So Riphah could put together their own program, their own curriculum of how they want to teach Islamic psychology. I do know that Dr. Amber Hawk has recently been brought on to Riphah, working with Dr. Anis. And so there is, I think, maybe a potential for there to be the development of like a curriculum. But even before that, or in lieu of that, there's quite a lot of development that can be supportive to the understanding of curriculum and training through different studies. So, looking at what are what are the needs of gaps of training, and where are there sort of, when somebody goes through a training program, often the issue is where do they go to practice, right? And so if somebody's really rooted in an Islamic paradigm and they want to practice that way, where they are going to practice also needs to be suited for allowing for this Islamically rooted bottom-up approach. Whereas sometimes people go into clinical milieus that are very much rooted in a Western model, and their only tolerances for sort of cultural adaptation. So some of the development that could happen is how to have actual clinics where students can be funneled into to practice in this way. So there's a number of things that can happen depending on people's institutional resources and priorities. Is there another question that you wanted me to answer, or do you want me to look at the comments?
Yes, if you could please touch on this as well. It's the same participant asking another question.
So there are many practices like gratitude, grounding are already related to Islamic teaching. Yes, that sounds more like a statement than a question. I can comment on that if you want. So yes,
that would be nice. That would be sufficient, in fact. So if you could please do that.
There are many practices that are done, that we find in the Western mainstream field of psychology, that are related to Islamic teachings. Some of that, if we were to look at, let's say, Martin Seligman and positive psychology and the idea of the gratitude journal, right? And there's a lot of data, a lot of research has been done on when we focus on gratitude. So they're even looking at what it does to the brain and attitude and positioning. And this is something that, people do their research, they discover this. But if we look at the tradition, we find this like fundamentally in early Muslim scholars' writings, but also we can find it directly in ayahs of the Quran, of like the believer is somebody who thinks positively of, has husn dhan Allah. And so we're always talking about be thankful and have gratitude. And that we're told in the tradition that the Prophet said that, that we should look to people that have less than us, not to people that have more than us. There's all these things that are not, we see them as just religious kind of nice sayings, but they are actually fundamental principles of how the human being positions themselves to be in a position of afiyah, of well-being. Because when the mind starts focusing on what you don't have, yes, the fundamental aspect is you deny the favors of your Lord, that Allah knows better than we do, and that we always have enough to be thankful for. But then on a level of psychology of how the mind functions, when we focus on what we don't have, it disconnects us not only from positivity and hope, but that hope comes from being connected to that there's something beyond us that knows better than we know. And so it does connect with our aqidah. Our psychological health fundamentally connects with our aqidah. And this is something that is not some sort of new development or discovery. It's something that we've always known, and we've always understood that the religious wisdom is for our mental health and our spiritual health and our physical health, because that's what Islam is for. It's to give us the map for how to be balanced human beings in this world. And we see, even on a scholarly level, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who was a scholar from the 9th century, who you may have heard talk about, we reference him in his work of developing something that very much looks like what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy. But something he said before positive psychology was a field or a specialty, he said that we should, and this is the 9th century, this is like 10, 11 centuries before positive psychology and the gratitude journal. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi said that we need to keep positive thoughts in our mind, just like we would keep medicines in a medicine cabinet. That maybe we keep medicine in a medicine cabinet, maybe we don't need it right now. We don't need all of the medicines in there, but they're there stored so that when we do need them, we can take them. And so this idea of keeping positive thoughts in the mind or in the awareness, so that when we have times of difficulty or we have bala, challenges and trials, we can recall and remember the positive things and that we can have gratitude for, that fundamentally shift the hal of the person, the state. So somebody can, these are fundamental treatments that are not just behavioral, they are spiritual, and they connect the heart to the source of what we're grateful to. You can be grateful for having things work out in your day, but when you are grateful to the source of that thing, it fundamentally changes the whole thing. Positive psychology works if you have gratitude because things are going well for you, is very different than having gratitude to Allah, who is the source of all things happening, for just allowing you to exist and blessing you with ni'mah. It completely positions your whole orientation of your heart in a different way, that then, yes, the effect is rida, of contentment, but it's not from this orientation, which is usually fundamentally oriented towards dualism, where we're just trying to get rid of the symptom of depression by covering it over with focusing on positivity, but actually that you're orienting the whole orientation of the soul and the heart to be a servant of Allah, to be reliant on Allah, and not to be self-directed. And so this is where the religious aspect becomes completely infused with and synonymous with the psychology.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Rothman. We have another question from one of our faculty members who's asking, what role does mentorship play? Like you said, align yourself with the sheikh or align yourself with somebody. In what way could we use that so that practitioners, they develop or they're grounded in the Islamic worldview?
Well, so I think this can happen on multiple levels. On one hand, there needs to be mentorship in knowledge, in terms of studying under ulama, scholars who are in this train of transmission of transmitting and teaching the Islamic sciences. And so there needs to be kind of an academic, scholarly, religious mentorship of making sure that people are connected to knowledge in a way where they're not just sort of going to Sheikh Google and learning just from whatever they can find in resources, but that traditionally Islam was taught through you would sit with a teacher, and that teacher would make sure that you're getting the things and understanding them and integrating them, and then be able to assess their level of understanding the knowledge. And so that's a very important part. We now are often oriented to just learning things online in an asynchronous way, where we're not able to be monitored by, are we actually understanding it in the right way? Are we in dialogue about knowledge and developing and debating and trying to grapple with? And that very much requires mentorship. But then from a clinical standpoint, and this is great if these can be in the same person, but we don't necessarily have the resources of professionals that are dual trained in this way. And so it may be that there's mentorship from the Islamic sciences, and then in parallel with that, there's mentorship in a clinical aspect. But then that clinical mentorship really needs to be versed in an Islamic way of working that understands how these things are integral and not just sort of seeing them as separate of like, okay, you have the Islamic sciences and then you have mentorship in clinical psychology and they remain not in conversation. So there needs to be both of these things, but there has to be, in both cases, supervision. You know, it's not just enough for people to take a course and learn the theory and then they go and figure out how to put it into practice, because there's a lot of nuanced aspects of what does this mean to implement this with clients. And so there needs to be in all of the cases where IIP certifies a program of study, the supervision aspect of it is fundamental and it's required. So they learn their course of study, which should already have some mentorship embedded in it. But then there's a period of supervision where they're working with cases, bringing cases to a supervisor and being able to work through what does this mean and what does this look like and how does this all play out in actual clinical contexts.
Thank you, Doctor. That was quite an elaborate view, and I'm sure any confusion that anybody's had regarding this is now gone. Another question that we have is, since the theme emphasizes on training the next generation, what qualities or what mindset do you think that future Islamic psychologists must cultivate? Or we know there's people coming into the field. What kind of prerequisites should be there for people coming into Islamic psychology, if any?
Many. I presented on them in detail. There was quite a number of slides in my presentation where I hashed out the exact qualities that I think that they should have, along with mindsets, and they were numbered on 3 different sets of slides. So maybe
Absolutely. And
yeah.
you also spoke of how Islamic psychology differs from modern psychology, especially when we talk about the concept of nafs and the spirit. So, how would we, in practice, implement that? If we like to take it as a key takeaway or as something that's explained briefly and in just a quick pointer, could you please touch on that as well?
Yeah, sorry, my camera just shut off. I think it overheated. Maybe it'll turn back on in a minute, but I can still speak. Can you just say that again? What
Sure,
was?
sure. I'll repeat the question. You spoke about nafs in a lot of detail and how that is one concept that differs from the Western psychology or modern psychology that we often practice. So, Islamic psychology, the key concept that's different is the nafs. Could you please touch on that aspect of it? How, and as much as you've explained in a lot of detail, but what could be a key takeaway or something that we could remember as a pointer that this is one thing that needs to be there when practicing Islamic psychology?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the nafs is the key difference, because the nafs is the sense of ourselves as separate. I mean, we can talk about the nafs as the whole soul that's integral, but essentially the way that we often talk about the nafs in the way that is referred to in the Quran is the sense, the person's sense of themselves. And so that's the self that we're used to talking about, which is the independent kind of individual self that is connected to our thoughts and our motivations and our desires. And and that's something that's quite familiar within clinical psychology. I would say what differentiates the Islamic model is the qalb and the ruh, fundamentally, because these things are almost entirely absent from any other mainstream or Western model. And so what that says is that when we understand the nafs, we have to understand that within that system of that independent self that has drives and motivations, it also has a spiritual dimension to it. The ruh is a spiritual entity, not just the kind of physical entity of the self and the mind, but it is a spiritual dimension that's fundamentally the same within the nafs. It's not two different entities, but that it existed before this life. So we have a prenatal identity, and the soul, the ruh, will exist after this life. So we have a post-mortem identity. And so that longer trajectory of the human being is fundamentally what positions Islam very differently. And what is very important to consider in an Islamic standpoint is that we're not dealing with just the personality and the thoughts of the human being and their own self-directed individual life. We are concerned with the state of the ruh, which is a spiritual reality of the human being that is fundamentally an abd Allah, that is a servant of Allah. And so any positioning of afiyah, of well-being that involves the holistic picture in Islam, needs to take into consideration that their well-being is fundamentally defined by their relative state of submission to Allah. Okay, so Islam means an active state of being submitted to God, and in that submission, experiencing wholeness or peace. And so the treatment goal from an Islamic standpoint would not necessarily be the removal of symptoms or comfort in the dunya or the removal of depression and anxiety just to achieve happiness. Those are things that can come along with it and that are often do, but the fundamental treatment in an Islamic perspective would be for the soul, for the holistic soul, to be in recognition of its reality, of its reliance on Allah. And so that has to take into account the spiritual dimension, and the heart, which has the ability to see things as they are. Allah says in the Quran, it's that the heart has this aspect or quality of yaqiluna, of perception, and that when we remove the veils on the heart from our deluded perception of independence and self-direction, and we submit our will to the will of Allah, that's when we uncover the veils on the heart and can be healthy and whole and submitted. And so that's really what differentiates an Islamic model from a Western secular one.
That was beautifully answered. Thank you so much, Dr. Rothman. Another question we have is and you touched on this briefly as well, that Islamic psychology is gaining recognition globally. However, it's a long way to go. How do you see it evolving in the next decade, for example, or the coming years?
I see it developing in pretty I would say in the next few years, there will be much more structure and differentiation for people to understand that there are different pathways. Up until now, because it's been relatively new for the majority of people, there's still a grappling with what is Islamic psychology and how do we define it, and now I think it's going to be a new era where people understand that there is like certain universals and there are many particularities. So to the point where we could even say that there are Islamic psychologies. So I think what will happen in the next few years is that there'll be more of a delineation of different schools of thought within Islamic psychology, which will then give rise to, and it is already happening, multiple pathways of training of different orientations. So you'll find some programs that are focused more on a cognitive behavioral model that's adapted with Islamic principles, but that still fits within more of a mainstream clinical milieu. You'll find some training and orientations that are much more religiously oriented, that are referencing religious text and are using religious language and that are particular only for Muslims. And then you'll find some orientations that are much more rooted in the spiritual paradigm of Islam, and looking at like what is the wisdom and guidance that Islamic psychology has to offer humanity, not necessarily just within a religious context for Muslims. And so I think you're going to find a lot of diversity, and hopefully, inshallah, because this is what we're working on, there will be some process of regulation for people to understand what are the different pathways, what are the pros and cons of each one of those schools of thought and approaches, and for there to be a platform for there to be more dialogue between those, so that it just becomes much more of a dynamic way of critical thinking where people can have different opinions, but there's a space and a platform for developing more knowledge. So any time in history where there's been the development of knowledge, there's always different contributions, different schools of thought, and different there's disagreements, and there's debates, and in a healthy way that's always existed in the Islamic tradition. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that, where instead of people trying to learn some sort of monolithic understanding of Islamic psychology, there will be many different approaches, and therefore there's going to be lots of institutions teaching different versions of it. But that hopefully we'll still have the connection of all of it and sort of the regulation of the practice, where people can be held accountable to ethics and standards of practice and codes of conduct that unite all those different approaches.
Thank you, Dr. Rothman, for explaining it so well. And as much as we would love to ask more questions and learn more and more about Islamic psychology, we do have a bit of a time constraint. And so we have to conclude the session. As we come to the end of this session, I would once again like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Abdullah Rothman for his time and thoughtful contribution, and of course to our head of department who made this all happen, Dr. Ruj Arshad, for her constant encouragement and always providing us with a platform. A warm thank you to all of the participants in the audience and for all of your contribution, all of your questions. We hope this session has been inspiring and enriching for everyone. Thank you once again, Dr. Rothman.
Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you, everyone, and Allah Hafiz.